The cost of regional transportation, the new DPS Superintendent, a uniquely Detroit story, and what's your American dream? MiWeek starts right now.
Did you know Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago? In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. We have a full show for you tonight, starting off with a closer look at regional transportation. Specifically, how much is it going to cost and how much we are willing to spend on it. We will take a look at what voters may be faced with coming up. Plus, you'll hear from the new Detroit Public Schools Superintendent, Alycia Meriweather, and a conversation with journalist David Maraniss, the author of Once in a Great City, A Detroit Story. That is all coming up for you tonight. But we are starting with regional transportation in Southeast Michigan. The RTA is working on a ballot proposal for November. We expect to hear details on what the plan is later this spring. But that really raises a lot of questions as to how much money should be raised by this millage, for what, and is the timeline just too tight to get the public on board? So let's bring in our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Guys, it's good to see you. Talking a little regional transportation. So when we're talking about this possibly being on the ballot, Nolan, and getting some money here, is it getting a little late in the game to start getting some public support for what we don't even really know yet?
I mean, it's going to be on the ballot. I think the law requires it to be on the ballot. Whether or not you can have time to generate public support, I think this has always been a tough sell for one reason. People already pay a regional transit tax in this town, and now they're being asked to pay a second regional transit tax, and 90-some% of the people in the region don't use mass transit, don't use the bus system. So you're going to now be paying two taxes for a service you don't really use, and while it may benefit your community, certainly benefit your businesses and all of that, unless you can convince people they're going to use this system, I don't know how you generate support.
Yeah, but if they're adding a little bit onto the system, wouldn't that go to saying, well, now if we add a little bit more spokes to this, you will be able to use it?
You've got to convince people to get out of their cars, and that's always been a hard thing to do in this region. But the more important factor is you've got SMART out there that people have said, okay, it's not a system that I would use, and now you're going to have this RTA system. They should have combined these three systems and said we're going to have one very flexible, very nimble system that you're going to be able to use, that you're going to have confidence it's going to stop at the right place and take you here, just like in other cities. And we're a car community.
Well, compared to other cities, we don't spend nearly the same amount in terms of transportation.
We don't, and we don't coordinate it in any reasonable way. I mean, DDOT and SMART still have problems figuring out who does what and connecting things together.
Wasn't the point of the RTA to finally get some kind of entity that would bring things all together?
Long term, that's what will happen. I think the approach here is sort of reflective of how hard it's been to get anything done for 40 years, and that you can't go from 0 to 100 overnight. And so rather than combining all the systems and saying we're going to have one that does everything, the idea was to create this and get it started with a couple of small scale wins to build confidence that transit can work for more people. Is that going to sell to voters? I don't know. I think it's going to be a very tough sell.
How do you sell that to voters then?
I think you sell to voters the idea that we will get more rational transit out of this, but that it won't. The problem is it's not going to happen overnight, and this particular tax is not going to create the system that we all really need. And so
And the big issue too is you don't have enough people working downtown yet to create a demand for this. I mean, the people who work downtown are going to vote for this and are going to look forward to it because it's going to be a good system. Hopefully, I mean, it's going to get you, but that's a very small percentage of the workers in this region. I mean, in other places, the central city is the major employment center.
But
Not
the
so
part of the
much
reason
here.
that downtown is not the major employment center is because for 60 years we've employed transit policy and other things, massive highway construction and all this other stuff that makes it
move
easier
people out of the
to
area.
move people out. I mean, at some point we have to decide whether, and we continue to do that, by the way. I mean, we're going to widen I-75 through Oakland County.
Me too.
That's a competing interest to better transit. It just is. And so you got to at some point decide what's the priority. Is it public transit, or we just want everyone to drive cars?
Well, if it's going to be public transit in this region, it's more probably going to be buses. I don't think we're going to launch some major subway project here when the Federal Highway Trust Fund is empty. So doing projects like widening 75 works very well, fits very well into a bus system, particularly a rapid bus system.
If you make it an
that
HOV,
leaves these communities and comes
if you make the
downtown.
lanes HOV, that's true.
There's no reason you can't.
Well, but there's all kinds of hurdles to that apparently. And that's what was on the drawing board. We're not sure if that's going to be the case.
But once the lanes are built, you can do with them what you want.
Actually, you can't. I mean, you can't. There are some legislative hurdles to, I guess, to
You can
making
clear
them
those.
HOV.
I mean,
We don't have.
You've got to relieve traffic congestion. And the sanest mass transit, or the most logical mass transit in this area, are those rapid buses.
Probably.
Really quickly, before we leave this topic, in terms of the cap of how much that they're going to be asking for, there seems to be competing questions about how much they even want to ask for in this.
Yeah, well, they want to put a cap on it because there's a weird anomaly in the law that says if there's no cap, then it counts against local millages.
What are they talking, half a million?
2 mil. They would cap it at 2. I don't think they need quite that much.
They cap it or they would go after that from the beginning?
No, there would be a limit on that.
So what do they go
overall.
after at the start?
I don't think they need to. I think they need more like.
I think we're
if
gonna-
you're
we're
only
gonna
gonna
hear
get
more
this
details.
once. I think you've got to go after what you need.
And we're
take
going
it all?
to hear more details in the next coming weeks. All right, turning now to Detroit Public Schools and yet another change in leadership. Recently, we had on transition manager, former bankruptcy judge Stephen Rhodes, talking about the future of the district. And one of the big things he has done is hire a new superintendent, Alycia Meriweather. She recently spoke with Stephen about the future of the district on American Black Journal. Take a look.
Of course, we talk all the time about DPS, and we intend to talk about governance or money. You really are focused on what are we doing in the classroom?
That is the critical piece. The purpose of a school system, the purpose of a school is to educate children.
Right.
And so if we're not doing that, and we certainly have some issues that need to be addressed in Detroit Public Schools to be able to do that more effectively. And I think having someone with an academic background, an academic perspective, making decisions, there's going to be hard decisions that have to be made. When you are making them in isolation of academic expertise, I think those decisions become very dangerous. Yeah. So I'm very thankful to Judge Rhodes for listening. Really, he listened to the community and to the DFT saying, we need an internal person on this transition team, and it needs to be someone with an academic background.
Yeah. So let's talk about the priorities then that you would have. Interim meaning obviously short term. We don't know quite how short term yet, but what are the things that you think you can get done?
So for clarity, interim means until we get a local school
There's
board.
a local school board, and then they'll decide.
And they will decide.
And they could decide to keep you, of course, but they could also go out and get someone else.
I would hope that the elected school board would choose the best qualified person to move the district forward.
Yeah.
And my job is to transition us to a point that we've put some things in place to keep us moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
And so in terms of how long it will be, that depends really on the legislation. There's different plans on the floor. And so my job is really to focus in on academics. Judge Rhodes has made it clear. He obviously is over the finance division. Detroit Public Schools is divided into 4 divisions. There's finances, and then you have academics, talent, and strategy. And Judge Rhodes has actually delegated academics, talent, and strategy under my leadership during this transition time, which is actually a very necessary move because strategy should never be done in isolation of academics.
Right.
Academics really can't do things outside of talent. So who are we hiring? Why are we hiring? Do we need to hire more music teachers? Do we need to hire more art teachers? Well, those decisions are driven or should be driven by academics. So they're all intertwined. Of course, all of it connects back to money.
Yeah.
But so we come back to obviously collaborating, but right now the division of labor is Judge Rhodes is the point person under finances, and then I have academics, talent, and strategy.
And what are the issues that are just waiting there to be resolved that you feel like, okay, I can jump in there and I can solve this right now?
Well, to be honest, I don't know that anything can be solved right now. To be clear, we did not get where we are
overnight,
with the quickness. So we are not going to get out of here with the quickness. But I do think an unapologetic focus on literacy is one of my main areas of focus, really looking at the pre-K to 2. But that would be helping students that are coming into the pipeline, students who are currently in the system who are not proficient in reading, writing, speaking, and listening, which are the standards, Common Core state standards. We have to also do some serious intervention and think about how we are grouping students for learning, how we are addressing the deficiencies, because just passing kids through because they're a certain age and that they need to go to a different grade level is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah. You got some good news recently that the graduation rate is actually going up. And not insignificantly, right?
It's a significant increase. Not only the increase over the last several years, consistently improving, but we're gaining on the state. So in other words, we're now 2 points away from the state average.
Right.
Now, to be clear, that's not my goal. My goal is not to be even with the state. My goal is 100% graduation.
Right.
And beyond that, 100% graduation with students who are ready
for the next step.
Yeah. And whatever that next step is, whether it's college, career, that we have students who are prepared to enter into that next phase of life. And when they go somewhere, a Detroit Public Schools diploma means something. That's my goal.
Yeah.
Now to a unique look at Detroit at a time when major factors like the auto industry, the power of labor unions, Motown, and the civil rights movement converged. I sat down with Washington Post editor and writer David Maraniss to talk about his book called Once in a Great City, A Detroit Story, and how 1 year in 1963 may have given us clues to Detroit's future. David, I love the story that you were inspired to write a book about Detroit after watching that M&M Super Bowl ad back in 2011. But how did you get from an M&M Super Bowl ad talking about Detroit to this era in the 60s that you concentrate on in the book?
Well, my first thought was, I'm not a financial writer. I wanted to write about a narrative history, and I wanted to capture what Detroit gave America. And so I also have this metaphor of setting my oil rig somewhere and drilling as deeply as I can. So I thought I could tell the story through a specific period. And it so happened that these 18 months in the early 1960s captured the 4 threads that I wanted to talk about: cars, music, labor, and civil rights. They were selling more cars than ever before. In 1963, Motown was booming and went off on its first Motortown review, taking that fabulous music to the whole country. The UAW was at its peak under Walter Reuther, and Detroit was a very central part of the civil rights movement, with Martin Luther King coming to Detroit in 1963 to deliver his I Have a Dream speech. So that's how I settled on that period.
And you were born in Detroit, though, so you're from Detroit.
Well, I was born here. I lived here for the first 7 years. My earliest, strongest memories are of Detroit, of Verner's Ginger Ale and the Bob Lobo and Hudson's department store. So in that sense, it's deeply rooted in me, yes.
Would you say, how would you characterize this book compared to the many other books that you've written in terms of research, time that it took you, and I guess that little personal connection that you have?
It definitely had more of a personal connection than most of my books. It took 3.5 years, which is about my rhythm for some reason. This book interconnected, it sort of had to weave together disparate elements. I did that once before in a book about the Vietnam War in the 1960s, but I love that challenge of sort of coming up with an idea and then inventing, but with deeply reported nonfiction, but inventing the structure of finding how it all fits together.
I find it fascinating that in the 3 years plus time that you were taking in writing this book were the pivotal years that Detroit was going through bankruptcy and going through that entire process. How did that figure and play into your mind as a journalist at the same time that you're writing this deep dive book back in the 60s?
You know, that's interesting because I've also written biographies of presidents while they're being president about their lives. In one sense, you have to sort of forget about what's going on and just focus on what you're dealing with. but it also very much influenced this book because I could see in some ways echoes of the past and what was going on in Detroit now, and also I could see the hope from the past of what Detroit could become. So it definitely influenced my writing.
It must have been interesting in going through a lot of that research and having what was the heyday of the 60s, early 60s in Detroit, and people saying the future is so bright, maybe Detroit could get an Olympics, but then knowing and seeing, starting to see some of the threads of what could potentially and what eventually did happen to the city of Detroit. What were some of those hallmarks or some of those flags saying the future may not be so bright for Detroit?
Well, one was the auto industry leaving Detroit, both financially and emotionally. Another was actually the unintended consequences of urban renewal, sort of unsettling the African American communities and the ripple effects of that throughout the city, not really paying attention to the depth of the importance of those African American neighborhoods and how to do it right. So race is always a factor, and I would say those are the two main problems that Detroit failed to deal with, sort of how to become more than a one industry town and how to deal with race.
So we still, people say, have a racial divide today. We still have questions around housing. We still have questions about employment and making sure that people have good jobs in this city as well, and that is that second part of where I think the city needs to be now. So when you look at where Detroit is now and you look at your research and where we have come, what kind of conclusions do you draw?
Well, first of all, in the 4 years that I've been working on the book and writing about it, Detroit has changed dramatically, and it is repopulating, and that's for the better, obviously. It is attracting young people to come into the city, but you can see in 1962 and 3 these tensions in the neighborhoods, and neighborhoods sort of starting to fall apart in different ways. And I think for Detroit to come back now, the focus on the neighborhoods is essential.
And it's interesting because you said you grew up in Detroit. You visited your old place on Dexter, but when you got there,
it was torn down.
Yeah.
There was tape all around it and the rubble. It had just been demolished. And probably 4 out of the 10 houses on that one block on Dexter had been torn down in the last year or so. And there are vast stretches, swaths of desolation still in Detroit. And the interesting thing is it has these great bones. The architecture of Detroit, both commercially and in the housing, it's really beautiful in some ways, but it just needs to be restored.
And so then when you sit down with someone like Mayor Mike Duggan as a journalist, after being the writer and writing about Detroit, what are your then key questions for him about what he's doing with the city?
Well, with Duggan, you don't even have to ask a question.
You just sit back and listen, I know that.
But what interested me was the specificity of his interest. It's not sort of rhetoric, whether you agree with everything he's doing or not. He understands what's happening on every block in the city. He actually knew the house that had been torn down where I had lived when I was 6 years old, and he understood why that block was changing and what he was trying to do about it. So, I think that he is, in that sense, a very committed mayor to figuring out every neighborhood.
All right, so if you're going to write the next book about Detroit, if you ever came back around and wanted to write another book, what do you think it could focus on?
Well, it would focus on a city that's reinventing itself from the very bottom and how that liberates it, but also the problems that it has to deal with. And I think that Detroit today, the school system is really the major issue, I would say. And until you resolve that, you can't really repopulate the city. You can't have it grow in its neighborhoods the way you want it to.
All right, David Maraniss, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Christy.
And finally tonight, a look at what the American Dream means. It's part of a Detroit Public Television initiative to tell people's stories as they navigate opportunity, meet obstacles, and try to achieve the American Dream in our country today.
I was born and raised in Detroit. I went to all Detroit public schools. When I actually started school, I didn't speak any English. My mom was pregnant with me on the airplane ride from Palestine to the United States.
I think my American dream, thinking about my parents who were born in Palestine and just the struggles that they had, and the fact that they can see me succeed. The fact that my grandmother, who is illiterate, can see her granddaughter graduate from college and from law school. It's always been about them and making sure that their sacrifice was worth it. Every time there was ever a sense of not belonging or the sense of the fact that I knew I was different when I went to a predominantly African American or Latino school, my grandfather, he would say that no matter what, you always have to fight for what belongs to you, and that includes your culture and who you are. So there was always this kind of strength in his voice and his experience that resonated so much of me growing up in Detroit. It's the experience that I had that created this kind of strength to have the courage to run for office. Is this sense of injustice and kind of feeling like I have to do something about it. My dad was more like, no one's going to vote for you after 9/11.
Speaker recognizes Representative Tlaib.
I was shocked, as everybody else was, that I actually won. I worked hard, that even though people were getting in their mailboxes reminding them I was Arab and Muslim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I was at a committee, and out of the blue, my chairman asks for my birth certificate, proof that I was an American-born citizen, and as a joke. And even though the audience gasped, people were so silent about it. Nobody called him out on it. Nobody held him accountable for saying something to me was so un-American of him. It's so personal and very emotional for me. It took this cartoon in USA Today depicting Muslims as Nazis. I looked at this and I said, my God, people are going to see this and they're going to want to kill us. And I was talking to my husband in our bedroom, not knowing, who was listening. If USA Today can publish something so hateful, and my son walked into the door, and Adam looks at me and says, Mama, don't worry. If anybody ever asks if I'm Muslim, I'll lie and tell them I'm not. And I paused. Of course, I cried. I had a long conversation with him the next day. And for me, that was a sign that I needed to work on Take on Hate. One of the things that came up last year was folks wanted me to come and run a racial justice campaign called the Campaign to Take on Hate. And I hesitated because it's exhausting working on any racial justice work.
The word hate is strong.
I know. Actually, the older folks that are older than me are like, that's so combative, can't we say take on love? And I said, we thought about that, and we think this really gets to the center of what we're trying to combat.
One more, 1, 2, 3, cheese.
And that's what we struggle with. I mean, Campaign to Take on Hate, although we're on campuses and local schools and we're trying to teach folks more about who we are, we're also teaching folks that do know to speak up and not be silent. We think that when you're silent, when you're not saying anything, it's almost like you're condoning and allowing it to grow.
Outside, hundreds of people, many if not all of them, against the mosque development.
There's a mosque moving from a neighboring city into Sterling Heights, and the opposition was tremendous. I've never seen anything like it.
We see them at the shopping around here in Sterling Heights. Can we prohibit this? Can we make a law against this?
They're cutting people's heads off. They killed our soldiers and everything.
We do not need this in our city. Pick another one.
It was bizarre because those are things that you kind of see on TV and movies, and it was actually happening right here in our backyard. It was very, very hateful. Like, go back home. This is my home. Where am I going to go?
Should a president's faith matter? Should your faith matter to voters?
And it's hardest when you hear Ben Carson, running for president and saying he doesn't believe somebody of Muslim faith should ever become president of the United States. So basically you're saying my sons should never ever even dream of the possibility. To hear that, I mean, it was so painful. He came from the same neighborhood as I did. This is a man that went to the same high school as I did. I remember being, I think it was 15, 16 years old, walking out of the gymnasium at Southwestern High, inspired and empowered. I can succeed like him. It doesn't matter that I'm poor, because he was poor. I've been to Palestine and I've been to other countries, and there's nothing like this kind of feeling that you have in our country, this kind of freedom. In some countries, you have to be a certain faith to be a citizen of that country. There is no German dream, there's no Canadian dream, there's only the American dream. Now I can kind of see this great need and desire to see that in my children, that they succeed and they continue not only embracing their culture as Arab Americans, but also being free and proud of their faith as Muslims.
What dreams do you chase? Share your dream at redreamproject.org.
And that'll do it for MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. Find us at MiWeek.org. We're also all over social media if you're into Facebook and Twitter. I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you back here next week for MiWeek. Take care.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015. It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.